Hey friends, I'm Jeffrey Rickman, and this is the channel PlainSpoken, but this is a series called Considering Charlotte that I've been doing for some time with some United Methodist friends of mine. I'm a global Methodist elder in the Heartland. I came out of the United Methodist Church. I regularly report on developments in the United Methodist Church, but I'm more and more in the global Methodist world. I've been reporting recently on developments in Africa and the United Methodist Church and many conferences and churches switching to the GMC. And if you're interested at all in that or interviews with presidents pro tempore over there, then I would encourage you to check out my other work. But this is mostly going to focus on expert positions. Got one clergy and two laity here today to talk about developments within the United Methodist Church since the General Conference met in Charlotte. That's why it's called Considering Charlotte. And in particular, jurisdictional conferences have been happening. The culture of the denomination is changing, and the guys thought it would be a good idea to talk through the nature of some of these changes. So for your edification and knowledge, this is Lonnie Brooks, and this is Odell Horn, and this is Joe DiPaolo. And the three of them are going to be helping me understand these things that I haven't been tracking really well. So I'm taking the position of a person who doesn't know what's going on, and each of these three will be helping me and hopefully you understand better how to navigate the waters of the United Methodist Church. So thank all three of you gentlemen for joining me. Odell, we were talking beforehand. I thought it would be most useful to have you kind of start us off by talking about your experience at the Southeastern Jurisdictional Gathering.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Jeffrey. It is good to see you guys again. I actually did not attend the Southeastern Jurisdictional Conference because I had some medical treatments, but I did watch them while I was out on, watched most of it while I was out on sick leave. And so there were a couple of things that sort of stood out at the Southeast Jurisdictional Conference, which is held in Lake Junaluska, North Carolina, from July 10th through July 12th, 2024, that I just want to bring everybody up to speed on. The first was we have 9 bishops down from 11 bishops in the Southeast jurisdiction. And for those of you who are keeping score, the Southeast jurisdiction is the largest jurisdiction in the United Methodist Church. It basically corresponds with the Southeast Conference in college football. And we have 9 bishops. And so as a result of the 9 bishops, there had to be some mergers of conferences. So the North Alabama Conference merged with the Alabama West Florida Conference. That will now be covered by Jonathan Holston, who is currently the South Carolina bishop. The North Georgia and South Georgia Conference merged into one Episcopal area, not into one conference. And I might be wrong by saying North Alabama and Alabama West Florida merged into one conference. They may just be one Episcopal area covered by a bishop. But Robin Deese, who's the North Georgia Conference bishop, will be covering South Georgia as one Episcopal area, but they will remain 2 separate conferences. And then Tennessee and Western Kentucky and Kentucky merged. So the Tennessee and Western Kentucky is one Episcopal area, whereas Holston, which is Eastern Kentucky, remains with the Southwestern West Virginia as the Holston Conference. And the Holston Conference will be sharing a bishop with the West Virginia Annual Conference, which is in Northeastern jurisdiction. So we have a bishop sharing between the Southeastern jurisdiction and the Northeastern jurisdiction, covering the West Virginia Annual Conference as well as the Holston Annual Conference. And then we have a bishop sharing both Western Kentucky and Tennessee, and a bishop sharing North Alabama, Alabama, Florida, and North Georgia, South Georgia. So it was a very interesting jurisdictional conference. Many of us, I'm part of the North Georgia Annual Conference, were anticipating that North Georgia and South Georgia would become one annual conference, and it would just be the Georgia Annual Conference, and that is not what happened. It will remain North Georgia, South Georgia, with one Episcopal area, but two annual conferences. So that really was the major news at the Southeast Jurisdictional Conference. Bill McAlilly, who was the Tennessee Western Kentucky Annual Conference, retired. So the switch was Leonard Fairley, who was in the Kentucky Annual Conference. He moved to South Carolina. Jonathan Holston, who was in South Carolina, moved to Alabama, West Florida, and Northern Alabama. And then just David Graves, who was the Alabama, West Florida bishop, he moves to the Tennessee, Kentucky Annual Conference, is plural, or one Episcopal area. So that was the major news. And then there was some minor news that happened at the Southeast Jurisdictional Conference. One was Sharon Austin, who was an Episcopal nominee for bishop in 2022 from the Florida Annual Conference, came to the microphone and gave a speech about returning to the scene of the crime. There were 9 Episcopal nominees in the 2022 Southeast Jurisdictional Conference. Tom Berlin was elected first. He's from the Virginia Annual Conference. He was elected to be the bishop of the Florida Annual Conference. And Connie Shelton was elected second. She's from the Mississippi Annual Conference. She was elected to be the bishop of the North Carolina Annual Conference. And then there were none. And we went through rounds and rounds of electing bishops, and no one got the majority. And there were 7 remaining, and 6 of the 7 remaining Episcopal nominees were Black nominees, including Sharon Austin. And then came a write-in candidate on day 1, which was Bishop Robin Dees from the South Carolina Annual Conference, who on day 1 stated that she was going to withdraw her name, even though she had been a write-in candidate nominated from the floor. Well, she was brought back in as a write-in candidate and would eventually become bishop. And Sharon Austin, who was an Episcopal nominee, addressed that from the floor. And I don't know the title of the speech that she gave, but she did use the phrase returning to the scene of the crime. And she gave the details of what happened at that Episcopal nomination in 2022 in Lake Junaluska, North Carolina. She said she meant no disrespect to the write-in candidates, but you could tell she was not happy with how the Episcopal nominees occurred in the 2022 Jurisdictional Conference in Lake Junaluska, North Carolina. The second thing is that Caleb Parker, who was with, I believe, the Virginia or the North Carolina Annual Conference, came up to the microphone and stated that when talking, and he was actually promoting regionalization, and he mentioned that some of the legislation, some of the petitions that passed at General Conference needed to be amended. And that, to me, was a red flag. We're passing legislation that both Lonnie and I know had problems, as Lonnie called it, fatal flaws, and a petition. I requested a petition, a Judicial Council declaratory decision at General Conference on one of the petitions that had passed concerning regionalization, which allowed annual conferences to create their own book of discipline. And the Judicial Council ruled in decision number 1500 that they did not have jurisdiction over that decision because it requires ratification, and that after ratification, I could bring this the petition back and request a declaratory decision. Catching up on that, and this is actually moved to the fall docket of 2024, David Livingston of the Great Plains Annual Conference requested a declaratory decision because one of the petitions that passed at General Conference allows jurisdictional conferences to have their own books of discipline. And so in decision, I think it was memorandum number 1506, which is on the fall 2024 docket, that David believes that that is unconstitutional. So what passed at General Conference, the petitions that passed at General Conference will allow, and Lonnie, correct me if I'm wrong, annual conferences to have their own books of disciplines, jurisdictional conference to have their own book of disciplines, as well as the general book of discipline for the United Methodist Church. Though that was the big admission, and that's the news. And Lonnie, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that was the essence of the question. You brought it the General Conference about the constitutionality of that portion of it, where a jurisdiction was given authority, or a regional conference was given authority actually, to allow one of its annual conferences to make adaptations. And there's clearly no constitutional support for that. So if that ever gets to the Judicial Council, I don't think they'll have any choice but to declare that to be unconstitutional. And that's a part of the regionalization package. I'm not sure how critical it was to the whole package, and I suspect that could be reversed and taken out of the legislation, and it would be acceptable from a constitutional point of view anyway. Whether it's acceptable to the voters in Africa or not yet remains to be seen. There's considerable question about that in my judgment.
It might be helpful just for those who are tuning in that are not as in the weeds as we are to remind them of what the regionalization plan was that was passed at General Conference. That the General Conference passed a measure that would allow adaptations of the Book of Discipline to various parts of the world. The justification for it is contextualization, so that the situation in, say, Nigeria or Zimbabwe is quite different than the situation in Georgia or California. So that different nations, different. I didn't think it was at the annual conference level. It was at the regional or the central conference level that they would be able to do that. But I guess what you're pointing out is that there was a clause to allow individual conferences to make adaptations as well, which I did not catch that. That's very interesting. But,
yeah, it's a provision that's kind of subtle in there, but it's there,
right.
And it allows a regional conference to transfer its adaptation authority to an annual conference.
Right.
And basically, the constitutionality principle here is that legislative authority can't be delegated.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to pass muster. Sure.
Let me
and the other
summarize
piece of the regionalization plan is that it has to be ratified and has yet to be ratified. So there has to be a 2/3 majority vote across all the annual conferences in the world to allow the regionalization plan to go into effect.
Let me summarize what I think I was hearing. I think I was tracking most of what was said, but what Odell just reported was because of the large number of disaffiliations and just general denominational decline that's been seen for some time, there had to be a lot of consolidations, not necessarily seeing a lot of annual conferences combined yet, but seeing a lot of bishops have to cover more ground than they've had to cover before and kind of consolidating the episcopacy. Seeing new constitutional complications coming from ostensibly new rights given to jurisdictions, which, according to the rhetoric at General Conference, jurisdictions are problematic and y'all are on the road to getting rid of them, but it sounds like they've been given more rights than they've ever had before. I feel like there was some continued drama you kind of touched on, Odell, where new bishops were holding on to past resentments and kind of insulting the past. I didn't quite catch what you were saying about Deese kind of trying to reopen old wounds, but was I right to pick up on, no, I wasn't right. So help me know how to process that particular segment of what you were saying.
Yeah, that was just Sharon Austin, who was an Episcopal nominee in 2022.
Okay.
Sharing her feelings about how the election of the 9 Episcopal nominees went, where we couldn't find 3 qualified Episcopal nominees, we had to get a write-in candidate. That's basically what she was. And she was not happy because 6 of the 7 that remained were Black, and we couldn't just get one over the hump. We had
So
to
it felt
go.
like a race thing to her, like they picked all the white ones and then didn't like any of the Black ones. Is that the inference there? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I did not pick up on that first go through, so I'm glad I came back to it. Lonnie, you've been watching this stuff pretty closely. What are some other things that you think are really important for people who care? Well, Odell's got something. What else, Odell?
I'm sorry. Yeah, one last thing that also related to race. When we did the nominations for jurisdictional as well as to boards and agencies of General Conference, race came up again because there were ethnic minorities in the Southeast jurisdiction were underrepresented. And it is amazing to see that because with most of the disaffiliations that happened, 97% of the churches that disaffiliated were white. Yet what people have noticed is that there was more diversity before disaffiliations, and there is less diversity since disaffiliations. And that was stated by Nora Coleman Norris of the North Georgia Conference. There were very few Latinos and Latinas who were nominated, and very few Blacks that were nominated for the boards and agencies of the general church and from the Southeast jurisdiction. And so it was just shocking to see how little diversity actually came out of the Southeast Jurisdictional Conference after disaffiliations.
Do you think that that's in part because African Americans and Latinos tend to be more conservative theologically?
Absolutely.
And so they would not necessarily be with the program, as it were.
Absolutely.
Of the new direction of the denomination. Interesting.
That is correct.
That's interesting. Okay, so that's something to keep an eye on is there's the denomination as it's designed on paper and the rhetoric used in assemblies and gatherings, but then there's the reality on the ground, which doesn't always comport with the rhetoric. So looking at those faces and personages represented in places of leadership could be evidence that it's been empty talk and that actually white liberal progressive culture is predominating at the expense of other constituencies. Okay, you're nodding your head, so at least I got that one kind of right. Go ahead, Joe.
I could give a really brief update on Northeast. So
Please.
Again, paralleling what happened elsewhere, the decline in numbers and resources, we went from 9 Episcopal areas to 6. We elected no new bishops. But we did, and I think Lonnie's going to address this, we are one of the jurisdictions that imported, in part, a bishop from another jurisdiction. So we will be sharing a bishop with the Southeast jurisdiction, Bishop Deborah Wallace-Padgett, who will be crossing jurisdictional lines to also have under her authority the West Virginia Conference. I think she now has the Tennessee Conference in her current jurisdiction. And so one of the things that happened at the Northeast jurisdiction, which by the way was the first one I did not attend. I was not a delegate for the first time since 1996. I was not a delegate. It's very interesting to be sitting it out. But they asked for a declaratory decision on whether or not it is constitutional to share a bishop across jurisdictional lines, and whether a bishop such as Bishop Wallace-Padgett can be a part of 2 different colleges of bishops at the same time, because she'll be part of the College of Bishops in both jurisdictions, and it's questionable whether that's permissible. So those are just there's also a repentance for the sin of racism that took center stage and other matters, but interesting some of the developments. There was also the sense that the jurisdictions are probably on their way out, but it may take some time. It may take several more quadrennial cycles for that to happen.
Oh my, several more. Is there reasoning presented as to why it would be several more quadrennial cycles to end a structure that pretty much everybody acknowledges is hopelessly racist?
Well, I think probably just because of the timeline. So the next time it could be acted on by General Conference will be 2028. Since that would require a constitutional change, that would take more time after that. So it might not take, I didn't really see the reasoning, but it would take at least 4 or 5 years anyway to get rid of it.
Okay.
And you'd have to get enough consensus of people wanting to get rid of it as well.
Well, I've been interested to hear Lonnie talk. Of course, I've read some of what he's written on Facebook, and you're a very good poster on Facebook. We're very blessed to have you distill your thoughts, Lonnie. Even political satire is appreciated here, at least by me, although I see some took issue. But Lonnie, I kind of wonder what distillations of wisdom you have in reflecting on what's happened since Charlotte, especially in light of these jurisdiction conferences.
Well, it's really interesting to me to hear Joe talk about the request for declaratory decision on the sharing of bishops across jurisdictional lines, and it'll be really interesting to see how the Judicial Council comes down on that. And I'd say right now it's an open question. There are some issues that have to be resolved in understanding that. And we in the West ended up in the same position with South Central. We're currently scheduled to share a bishop between the Western jurisdiction and the South Central jurisdiction over who presides in New Mexico. Things happen in the West later, because of the clock, than they do in the rest of the church in the United States. And so we knew in the West that the South Central jurisdiction had not assigned a bishop to New Mexico, and of course that was an indicator, and it didn't take any real insider intelligence to see what was going to happen there, because New Mexico has to have a bishop, and New Mexico, of course, protrudes out geographically and has always been over in what should have been the West all along, and so we've those of us who were not on the Committee on Episcopacy could see that more than likely we were going to assign a bishop from our jurisdiction to preside there, and that's exactly what happened. So we have a dog in that fight too, Joe. So we'll see how that comes down in the Judicial Council. That probably is the issue that will be the predominant issue coming out of the jurisdictional process this time around. It was our lot in the West to be different, as that's not an unusual thing, of course, for the West to be different. But this time we were in the position of having to elect 2 bishops. And that came about because the solution that came out of General Conference and how to adapt to the reduced budget to limit the number of active bishops to 32 in the jurisdictional system, which meant that there would be no elections, assuming there were no more retirements or disabilities. Well, assumptions are exactly that. They rarely fit reality, or it's unusual when they do anyway. And this time, exactly that happened. So Bishop Beard in the North Central jurisdiction needed to take extended medical leave, and Bishop Schnese in South Central decided to take retirement rather than early retirement from some points of view anyway, which is, by the way, exactly what he said he was going to do when he was a candidate for election, that he would not serve out all the quadrennia for which he was eligible. And so he was just fulfilling his promise in one way to look at that. So that left 2 vacancies in that number of 32. And with the plan having been to transfer 2 bishops from other jurisdictions to the West, that left us having to elect 2, and we did that. And as far back as I can remember, this was the first time since I've been involved, and that's been since 2000, the Western jurisdiction did not elect anyone from a racial or ethnic minority group to be a bishop. There were two white women elected, one a self-avowed gay woman, and the other and this was really unusual, a one-term bishop, Sandy Olwine will only have one quadrennium to serve before she must take mandatory retirement, and that was a strategic decision in my judgment and she was appointed as expected, assigned to serve the California-Nevada Annual Conference and aid it through its process of healing from the separation of ideas and positions with respect to the continuing service of Bishop Minerva Carcaño in that annual conference. So we look forward to that. That conference does need to go through some healing, and we fully expect that Sandra Olwine will be the right person to be there to guide that conference through that.
Carcaño has retired now, hasn't she?
She will retire. I think that those retirements become effective September 1. Isn't that how that works for bishops? Yeah. So she will continue to serve through August and then retire at the beginning of September when the new bishops will take their seats.
I haven't heard a single thing about her stepping back into the helm since she charges against her they weren't dropped, but she was found not guilty of the charges. The impression I get is there's just not much there, and she's just serving out the rest of her time.
I don't have that exact same impression, Jeffrey. I think she did resume her seat as the bishop in that annual conference and presided, doing the things bishops do. Mm-hmm.
I was just saying I wasn't aware of any more drama around dysfunction in that annual conference since she stepped back into the helm. So,
well, there wasn't any public drama about that, but the kind of division that was apparent there in the trial, where we had some folks from that annual conference testifying on one side of that and others on the other, and those divisions are not quick to heal, and so that has been an ongoing process there, and will be a process through which that conference has to go on into the future for some time, hopefully under the leadership of Sandy Olwine and others who are involved in that. We'll see a brighter future going forward for that conference. And that's an important conference in our church. They've been a leader in many ways in our jurisdiction for a long time, and through the whole church.
How have they been a leader?
In my judgment, they've been a leader in contributing considerable racial and ethnic diversity to our church. And I think that's worth pursuing a little bit here, because as Odell was leading us into, much of the diversity of church, despite protestations to the contrary from the Western jurisdiction, comes not from the Western jurisdiction, but from South Central and Southeast, and even the other two jurisdictions as well. But predominantly, something like 60 to 70% of the African American United Methodists are in the Southeastern jurisdiction, and some similar proportion of the Hispanic United Methodists are in the South Central jurisdiction. And exactly the same holds true, maybe not quite as overwhelmingly, the Native American United Methodists are predominantly in South Central, at least in large part because of the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference there. However, then the Western jurisdiction, and this includes significantly the California-Nevada Annual Conference, the Pacific Islanders and Asian United Methodists are predominantly from the West. So the West does have that, and I think that's a significant contribution to the life of the United Methodist Church.
So then, as you highlight the fact that
Sorry,
the two new bishops are white women, to you that's an additional failure, because they had been leaders before in elevating people that weren't white, and now they've chosen to elevate two white ladies. Did I hear a tinge of that, or did I misread your words?
No, that was a misperception. At least I did not intend that to say that was a failure by any means. No, I think as I've stated before in this conversation and in other places as well, my primary concern isn't over the identity of the candidate, but the merit and the qualifications of the candidate. And I believe both these folks who were elected were qualified for the office, highly qualified. And so I don't fault anybody for casting a vote for them. That's an important thing to remember. And I think this is important in evaluating the comments by the person whose candidacy failed in November 2022. Our process of electing bishops gives every voter in the process the right to put any name of a qualified candidate on the ballot, and that person doesn't have to have been nominated. That's our process. And to say that the process failed, well, I think that's just a misperception of the intent of the process. I think the best example I could offer of how that works, and has worked in the past, was when Cal McConnell was elected to be a bishop in the Western jurisdiction. It took 43 ballots. And he wasn't a candidate prior to the conference at all. In fact, the conference was deadlocked for, I don't know how many ballots, but through probably 40 ballots was deadlocked between two candidates. And so finally in a back room somewhere, they said, well, who else can we put up here? And they said, well, let's just start voting for Cal. He's sitting over there not doing anything. And so sure enough, within just a few ballots, and after they decided they were going to go somewhere else, Cal McConnell was elected to be a bishop. He's got the record. I think that's how it worked then. 43 ballots.
Let me ask.
It was interesting to see.
Go ahead.
Yes, sure.
I wanted to ask about something I remembered from the General Conference, because I remember that they were trying to figure out how they were going to move bishops around, and it was not fully equitable based on population density. Rather, there was as I recall,
missional needs.
Yeah,
that's one of the constitutional questions.
It was maintain 5 bishops in each jurisdiction. That's what I remember. The minimum number of bishops being in each jurisdiction, whether or not the money adds up. So how much did that particular decision impact what we're seeing now at what's happening in the jurisdictional conferences?
I think they originally envisioned that there would be whole transfers across jurisdictional lines, that a bishop would be entirely moved from one jurisdiction to another. But that didn't happen. And part of the reason two reasons. One was one of the rules that went into place was that a bishop had to have served at least 4 years, I think, before they could be eligible for that kind of move in their original jurisdiction. And that ruled out everybody that was elected in 2022. And then it also required that the bishop had to give his or her consent for a whole transfer. So apparently it reduced the number of bishops that were even eligible to be transferred across jurisdictional lines. And then what they wound up doing was proposing the sharing of bishops across jurisdictional lines, which I don't think was the original idea.
Oh, no, it never had been in the plan that came out of the General Conference. Sharing bishops was not part of it. But there are 4, and these are pre-existing. The General Conference, this last General Conference, didn't institute these rules as new rules. they've been there for a very long time. The process of a transfer of a bishop has been there since the United Methodist Church was formed.
Just hasn't been used.
Actually, I think it predates that, back to the Methodist Church prior to that. But we had, a bishop had to have served 4 years in the jurisdiction where he or she was elected. Then the bishop proposed for sending the bishop had to agree. The jurisdiction to receive the bishop had to agree, and the bishop had to agree. So those four, and any one of those craters the idea, the failure. And so it turned out, and I don't know why there's secrecy about this, but there is. They're not going to tell us which one of the four or how many of the four created this proposal to transfer these two bishops to the Western jurisdiction. But either because the bishop wouldn't agree or the jurisdictions wouldn't agree, and the other one, the 4-year thing, we know about that one. So none of those newly elected bishops were eligible. But the system broke down and we had to elect these two in the West. Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a question here that needs to be asked. And I've asked the Council of Bishops to ask this question of the Judicial Council, whether or not a missional basis, a missional needs, forms a legitimate basis for determining the number of bishops in the jurisdictions. And I believe that the probability is that's not constitutional, because the Constitution already says that the criterion for assigning the number of bishops in the jurisdictions must be uniform. And there's no possibility of uniformity in that process without some predictability. And you have to be able to calculate it, and you can't calculate missional needs. That's entirely a subjective process. Science is the observation and classification of reproducible phenomena. And there's nothing about assessment of missional needs that's reproducible, because no two people are going to come up with the same answer.
Well, it does seem to me, for instance, that you could use a simple population density model and simply apportion bishops according to population density. That would seem much more equitable to me than whatever it is they're doing right now. Is there a reason why
that's what this missional needs thing is replacing?
Right.
That kind of calculation.
Based on the membership numbers, right.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, that question needs to be asked, and the folks in the Western jurisdiction refused to ask the question because they thought it would threaten the process that had been put in place. Well, it's not. It wouldn't, because this is all done now and it's in the books. So the Judicial Council is not going to make a retroactive decision and undo what has just been done by the jurisdictional conferences with respect to the bishops. That's going to stand. That I don't think they could possibly make that work.
Well, and doesn't that kind of follow what we've seen over the last number of years, which is, what do they say? Change the facts on the ground. and then the rules later have to catch up, because it's very hard to undo precedents that have been set. And I think you saw that with General Conference and the embrace of gay marriage and gay ordination that was already happening. And so now you're having this happen with the way bishops are deployed. It's going to be very hard to undo things once they're already in place.
Yeah, exactly. So, and if this this process of basing the number on missional needs is indeed unconstitutional, well, we need to know that so that we can put in place for the next General Conference to act on a system that is constitutional, or we need to come forward with some proposal to change the Constitution. That's more difficult to do, of course. I think it would be easy, not easy exactly, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility that we could construct a uniform basis that would be constitutional, that would solve the problem.
part of what we've come around to several times, but we haven't talked about directly, is the Judicial Council. I remember watching General Conference, and there was a lot of pretty firm push and pull around new members of the Judicial Council, how many needed to stay on versus a clean slate. In the previous slate, there was one serving that was openly an activist for progressivism. And I just say that because he led a reconciling ministries church, which at that time, being a reconciling church was against the Book of Discipline. I don't know if it is now. But it seemed to me that all the replacements were verifiably, well, like they were activists. They were far left. They were going to rule a certain way, and they were people constituting sexual minorities, I think. So I wondered if any of you had any insights or projections so far as the kind of decisions that, do you think that they're going to render similar decisions using similar rationale to previous slates of Judicial Council candidates, or do you think that you're going to see a very different ethos prevail in the juridical rulings from that crew? Nobody wants to bite that.
Well, yeah, I want to take it, but Odell is
Looks
probably first
eager.
in line
Looks
here
eager.
to react to
Odell,
that.
it has been a minute since we heard you. Why don't you give your thoughts on that?
First, Jeffrey, I did find the clips from the Southeast Jurisdictional Conference, and I did send that to your email.
Okay.
Second, you have raised the question that I have asked to myself. If the declaratory decision that I requested at General Conference is ratified, if what I was asking for, declaratory decision, if that petition that passed General Conference is ratified, I am going to come back with a request for a decision. We have a new Judicial Council. What's the likelihood of that declaratory decision that I requested getting a favorable hearing with this new Judicial Council? Yeah, that is a question. I think that Memorandum 1506 will be the test for, which is, again, Memorandum 1506 is brought by David Livingston. Great Plains Conference, jurisdictional conferences have the right to have their own books of discipline, and that will be the test for my declaratory decision. But yeah, you have raised the question that I have been thinking about.
Well, there's no question that the progressives swept the elections clean on the Judicial Council, as they did most everything else at this past General Conference. Virtually all the members who are serving now, and we elected a whole new Judicial Council for the first time ever since the beginning of the Judicial Council. So all 9 of them are newly in office. Now there's some that were reelected, so they're not newly serving, but they're new in their terms here. And for the first time that I remember, 2 of the 9 were elected from the Western jurisdiction who are active, and one of the reserve alternate members is from the West, and that's absolutely the first time that could possibly happen. I haven't researched that to know for certain, but to have 3 members there potentially serving on the council at any one time from the West is a first, and we're noted as progressives out here. I'm not one of them, but yeah, the Western jurisdiction is predominantly progressive, overwhelmingly now, certainly.
I'm always looking for like simplistic understandings of things, but from this conversation, I'm feeling like a simplistic but true saying would be that if you're looking at the episcopacy and the judiciary of the denomination, it is massively overrepresenting the Western jurisdiction. Would that be a fair assessment?
It is, absolutely. Yeah, sure. The minimum of 5 bishops from a jurisdiction guarantees that.
Yeah.
That the episcopacy will be overrepresented from the West, for sure.
Because the membership of the West is so much smaller comparatively to the to the other jurisdictions.
No, we're smaller than the Western North Carolina Annual Conference.
Right. So it's remarkable. I think one of the other interesting things is, to get back to your question, Jeffrey, is it does seem the Judicial Council over the last several years has been very amenable to give the bishops what they want. And so I wonder whether you're going to get that hearing that you want, Odell. I guess one of the questions for me is whether we're going to get back into constitutional balance. We in the secular realm, they for years talked about the rise of the imperial presidency. Well, I think we've seen the rise of the imperial episcopacy, where bishops have been taking authority to themselves that go beyond their legitimate realm. Whether it was not upholding the decisions of 2019 General Conference, declaring unilaterally that 2553 does not apply outside the United States, having jurisdictional conferences in 2022, which the Judicial Council allowed. I mean, it seems to me that the bishops have they've come to a place where they have a disproportionate amount of power constitutionally than was intended, given the other two branches, the legislative and the judicial.
I believe that's true, Joe. And this notion that we're sharing bishops now across jurisdictions raises the specter of what's the implication of that internationally. It's one thing for the Western jurisdiction and the South Central jurisdiction to share one bishop to preside in New Mexico, or for the Northeast and Southeast to share one in West Virginia, that kind of thing. But what if California, Northern California, and say Sierra Leone are asked to share a bishop?
Well, and that's kind of happening now, right? Bishop Warner Brown.
Well, he's retired, so it's
right. But he had been leading the Sierra Leone Annual Conference.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. But it's different. It would be different to at least some difference for an active bishop to preside simultaneously in
as a long-term arrangement. Yeah, right.
So that's the specter that this new thing raises, and whether it's considered to be constitutional or not is a question for the Judicial Council to answer. And I'm pretty pleased to know that question's been asked, so they're going to have to deal with that. But even if it's constitutional, it doesn't solve the issue of the fundamental issue of regionalization and what does it mean to regionalize when we're not regionalizing the episcopacy simultaneously. That's been my fundamental question about regionalization from the beginning. Have we regionalized anything of substance if we haven't regionalized the episcopacy?
Well, and the boards and agencies, that I know I'm annoying about that, but is there any indication that there's going to be a redistribution of power in the general boards and agencies? Okay. I mean, I haven't heard anything like that. It's one of those things where so far as I'm concerned, it's been a lot of virtue signaling and nice sounding rhetoric, but in the end, it seems to be that a certain constituency is overrepresented at the expense of other ones, and that's the episcopacy, that's the judiciary, and the general boards and agencies of the denomination. I just wonder, Odell, it's unfair to ask you to represent an entire constituency, but I do wonder how Black folks that are inside the UMC are generally seeing it. Are they just going, well, business as usual, no big deal, or are they sensing that there has been a cultural takeover? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, there is definitely a sense of white folks are going to do what white folks are going to do in the Black church. And there is this, the bishops have sounded the alarm with the election of the people at the Black Methodist Church Renewal has sounded the alarm with the election of this delegation, is that there were, particularly in the Southeast jurisdiction, there were fewer Black folks elected in the Southeast jurisdiction and this general conference than in recent years. And so there is this notion that the more liberal that this denomination becomes, the whiter it will become. Mm-hmm. And that is definitely something that Black folks in the Southeast jurisdiction have been talking about behind closed doors.
And when you say elected, Odell, you mean elected to serve on the general agencies is what you're talking about, right?
No, just the
No.
delegation makeup
Well,
of the
Oh,
2000.
to serve in delegations. Okay.
Well, and I think your observation certainly is true globally. We're seeing now large parts of the African church break away. So the irony is that the new rules passed at General Conference, which purported to make the church more inclusive, are having the effect of making it less so because we're losing massive numbers of people of color from other parts of the world.
Yeah,
Most
Ivory
recently,
Coast
examples is
dropped
Nigeria.
out. Liberia, they're really pushing to drop out. Nigeria just made a big pronouncement. Looks like there's going to be a robust conversation in Simon's country, Zimbabwe. It's hard to predict, but it looks like there's huge fallout. We were talking about Judicial Council a moment ago. I saw just a headline earlier that former United Methodist Women, now United Women of Faith, has asked for a declaratory decision from the Judicial Council with respect to something in Nigeria. Odell, you're shaking your head like you know what that is. What is that?
It sounds like there's some property that United Women of Faith owned in Liberia that the Liberia Annual Conference took over.
Okay.
And so they're requesting a declaratory decision about ownership on that property.
That makes sense. Broadly, I was like, why on earth would United Women of Faith care about how property is managed in Liberia? Okay, that makes sense.
The heritage there is from when they were the women's division of the General Board of Global Ministries. They own a lot of property around the world, and some in Alaska, for that matter.
Before that, they were the Women's Foreign Missionary Society. Right?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. Right. Okay. Let me ask about you kind of spoke to this earlier, Joe, but I wanted just kind of a firmer understanding. In the lead up to General Conference, the people who proposed the regionalization plan, Christmas Covenant, and the larger plan, all acknowledged that the jurisdictional conferences had a racist history that was irredeemable, that the utility of the jurisdictions was over, that if it was an equitable system, the jurisdictions would be ended and it would only be regions. Lonnie in our groups was very clear, providing a new level of management. It's a whole other level of ecclesiastical oversight. For the Americans, just makes no sense and is sure to provide inequities and complications. And then on the floor of General Conference, I remember that when the people presenting the regionalization plan came forward, they said, yes, we acknowledge it's a flawed plan, jurisdictions need to be dealt with, but we in our infinite wisdom, she didn't say that, have determined that needs to happen at a later date. But for right now, we just need to approve this. And so, to my mind, there was a tacit understanding that I think a reasonable person would come away from, that at these jurisdictional conferences, they would be talking in very real terms about closing up shop and transferring everything to a new American regionalized system. But from what I'm hearing from you guys, no such talk took place, and in fact, they're continuing on very comfortably utilizing this structure that everybody says is racist, but for some reason we can continue forward in it and it's not too big a deal. Have I come away with a wrong impression?
I think they are talking, at least they did in Northeast, about how they did talk about how the jurisdictional system needs to be on the way out. Okay. But the sense was that they needed time for the various conferences and colleges of bishops to work together to develop a more cooperative culture, as a way of preparing the way for that, I guess.
A more cooperative culture.
That's been the problem, right? Since before 1939, there was no jurisdictional system. General Conference was where all bishops were elected. Bishops were bishops of the entire church. They would be sent anywhere. Then the jurisdictional system was put in place mainly as a way to segregate Black folk and Black bishops, prevent a Black bishop or a Northern bishop from presiding over a Southern conference. It was a way, in a sense, the jurisdictional system was an early form of regionalization.
Right. The Southeastern jurisdiction was a manifestation of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. It just recreated the
Right.
Methodist Episcopal Church South in that jurisdiction.
So it's what's interesting is you see now this centralizing tendency in the U.S. to get rid of, I think eventually they will, the jurisdictional system, and bishops now, the lines becoming more porous, bishops being shared and so forth, at the same time that they want to kind of harden the lines with regionalization in other parts of the world. But I think Lonnie's point is a well taken one. As long as the episcopacy is not regionalized, there's still going to be that centralizing tendency through the episcopacy.
Yeah.
I think.
So Odell took the time to select 2 clips for us to watch together. Odell, do you think now is a good segue part for that? Okay, is there anything that you want to say to pitch these before we play them for us and our audience?
Yeah, but before I do that, first, I really would like Simon to have been here because we haven't talked about Africa at all. And so
Right.
that might be a future episode because there's a lot going on in the United Methodist Church in Africa. But the first one is that is Sharon Austin, and she's addressing the Episcopal nominations, and she does this so eloquently and so with dignity. So I just want you all to hear how this process went down and how it felt for her.
Sharon Austin, Florida Conference, clergy, African American. Bishop, I would like to have a point of personal privilege.
Certainly, go ahead.
I want to thank the good faith efforts of the interviews and drafted the Racial Bias Task Force and the opportunities the report provided. And I'm standing here today as one of the 2022 Episcopal nominees because people are more than a report. For me, and for some of the 2022 Episcopal nominees, this conference feels like a return to the scene of the crime. A colleague recently used that term in our conversation when she approached me with no prompting from me. It's been 20 months since I and other Episcopal nominees stood before you in this auditorium. I experienced trauma returning here. This was the space in which harm was done and experienced. Sadly, we couldn't figure out how to have an SEJ conference without first having a general conference in 2020. Couldn't figure that out until 2022. 6 clergy of ethnic minority, color, and culture offered themselves for Episcopal leadership. Right out of the gate, during the elections, we elected a white male, quickly followed by the election of a white female. What transpired reflected a frenzy in which it appeared that none of the 6 nominees vetted and following the SEJ's prescribed process would be able to be elected, and in fact, we were not. When we finally elected a person of minority, color, and culture, it was the result of a nomination from the floor. It left me stunned because it suggested that no person of color endorsed, vetted, and following our Episcopal process was actually worthy to be elected by our process. Here are some of the aspects of this experience that the report cannot capture. The report does not capture the pain that we feel, that is exacerbated by the fact that we can only figure out how to crack the door and elect 1 woman of color per SEJ gathering, and this time the wait was 8 years between those elections. I came with family in tow, 6 years. I came with family in tow, 1 spouse, 4 adult children, and 2 little grandchildren. People often wanted me to know that my age and the resulting abbreviated tenure would be a complication for my election. I am proud to tell you that I graduated from Candler School of Theology 45 years ago last month. And when I did, only 1 black woman graduated in a class before mine. I may have forgotten more about ministry than some people will ever know. If my age and therefore my term was problematic, it doesn't explain the reason we didn't elect any of my colleagues of color. They are all younger than I. So I can tell you something about rejection and elimination. The report did not capture the myriad of questions that I received from other United Methodists and non-United Methodists who watched the live stream and attended in person, asking, how could this happen? How could the 6 of you be so disrespected? We were rejected individually and eliminated from consideration as a group. An opportunity was missed, and it was missed by jurisdictional caucuses, especially important in the South, where we live with the pall of racism in very particular ways. It has always been the case that people of color are good enough to do some work, but not good enough to do other work. We have seen the elections over the years, and I mean no disrespect, but we are tired of trying to be exemplary when others may have had the privilege of mediocrity. We passed epic legislation at General Conference, but we need not shout hallelujah if we think be a fully inclusive yet racist church. That's an oxymoron.
I didn't see how long the clip was, but we kept at it a good while, and I think we got a good sense for what she was talking about. And of course, you know, nobody's going to argue with her. The impression I've had, though, of the Episcopacy in the U.S. is that black congregations only represent between 3 or 4% of the congregations, but they represent more than that among the Episcopacy. So, Odell, does this sound... So there's the larger concern, but then there's just the interpersonal treatment of candidates. And so the larger concern both can be true at the same time. There's an overrepresentation of black people in the Episcopacy, but even so, those candidates coming forward are routinely treated differently, worse than people from the majority culture. Is that the takeaway you came from with it?
This particular time around. And again, one of the things that was said at the Black Methodist Church Renewal Conference, there was a courtesy in the Southeast jurisdiction of electing black bishops in particular. And that courtesy was extended by the evangelicals. Mm-hmm. That was one of what one of the bishops said. And so I don't know. I know what the sociology says. When you take courses in African American studies, the more liberal a denomination becomes, they will elect black bishops. But I see a recentering of whiteness in the United Methodist Church.
Okay. Joe, I guess I'm feeling like we need to hear your voice a little bit more before we conclude. So is there any way you'd like to attempt to wrap up the conversation for today? Are you muted, Joe?
Yes, I muted myself.
There you go. Okay, here we go.
I'm not sure they have a whole lot more to add. It just seems like we're still in a very fluid kind of situation, waiting for a lot of these decisions to come down and how they work out. And also, we need to wait to see whether regionalization gets ratified. The defections of African conferences will impact that now in terms of numbers, I guess. I'm not even sure how that impacts it, because will the 2/3 majority be based upon numbers prior to their leaving or after? That's another question I guess Judicial Council will have to deal with. So there's a lot of stuff that's kind of up in the air to see how it plays out.
Lonnie, any closing thoughts?
Just to pick up on what Joe said there, the issue of the voting on ratification of regionalization is going to be a really burning issue with respect, for example, to Côte d'Ivoire. Their announcement that they intend to withdraw, well, they're going to be continuing members of the United Methodist Church until they have withdrawn.
Right.
So the probability is high that from a technical point of view, they should be voting on a ratification. But I can guarantee you that those in the United States who are vigorously supporting ratification will do everything they can do to see that Côte d'Ivoire is excluded from voting on ratification. And so be alert to that and see what happens.
Yeah, at least in the U.S., last round of jurisdictional conferences that I covered whenever I was still United Methodist, they passed a resolution saying, hey, you guys that are intending to leave, even though you're still members, you're bad people if you vote. And so you're morally obligated to vote. And it'll be interesting to see if they take that same snide tone with majority world Africans rather than equally privileged white Americans. But it's the same moral issue altogether is, well, we're not going to let you go. We're going to keep you in, but it's wrong for you to speak. You get no voice. And that's a pretty interesting position to hold. So, Odell, let's give you the last word, and then we'll conclude today's conversation.
I have an article coming out next week in Firebrand about General Conference with details, so that people will know who said what when. And so that'll drop, I believe, August 1st.
Would you send us a link
actually,
when it comes out?
yeah, actually probably the first Tuesday in August, so not next week, the week following.
Okay.
So it might create some enemies, but that is representation is important, but also theology and people who the Wesleyan Covenant Association was thoroughly neutralized at General Conference. However, I don't think that mainstream UMC really understands how many traditional conservative Orthodox Christians are in the United Methodist Church that were not a part of the Wesleyan Covenant Association. And so I don't know what the future looks like for the United Methodist Church.
Closing question, and this is representing my primary constituency, which is people, primary constituency in the United Methodist Church, people who are not happy to be there, who didn't make it out either because their conference didn't let them or because they didn't meet certain deadlines. The only constitutional question that I'm familiar with that could allow them still to exit is paragraph 2549 has been utilized by some annual conferences as a sort of, it's not supposed to be disaffiliation, but they use it effectively as that. My understanding is that it's been referred to the Judicial Council. I assume because they all lean left now, they're going to say, nope, can't be used that way anymore. Do you all agree with me?
I have a reservation. I think by and large you're right about that, Jeffrey, but there has always existed the negotiated path for exit, and that still is there. It will be used. It's more effective for the very large churches, but
I do think we're going to see over the next couple of months, there's 5 or 6 lawsuits at least that are going around the country of churches and group lawsuits to leave, and they've been passing the first number of hurdles. And if I think we're going to hear any day now about Maryland, and if the judge in the Maryland case does not, at declaratory judgment, does not dismiss the case, then it goes to trial. And if that starts to become a pattern, I think you're going to see a real incentive for conferences to negotiate settlements, because nobody wants to go to trial. Trials are expensive, unpredictable, and then lots of stuff comes out publicly that people probably don't want.
I think that's a good cliffhanger to end on. There's still a lot of things moving on the ground, so I appreciate all three of you making the time, Lonnie, Odell, Joe, share your expertise, and I hope, viewers, that it's been a benefit to you, especially those in the United Methodist Church. Knowledge is power. I hope that this has been a comfort to you and that you feel like you're more in the know. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, so may our efforts here be a blessing to you and your participation in your local church. And if you want to stay tuned, I very much doubt this is the last time we're doing something like this. So go ahead and subscribe to PlainSpoken, and you can email me at plainspokenpod@gmail.com with any questions for these guys or future topics you'd like us to cover. But for now, we're going to say adios. Take care, guys.